I don't know how you set about clearing your mind, clearing your head, but for a lot of people, it's accomplished with a little walk around the neighborhood or maybe in a park nearby somewhere. And perhaps it's just you solo, or perhaps it's you with your spouse, or maybe you take the dog for a walk. For our featured guest today, that idea was put on hyperspeed and magnified several times over. I'm happy to introduce you to Rick McKinney. He and his wife, Jane, have a book called And So We Walked. And what a story this is, as they walked 2,770 miles. So, Rick, we obviously have a story to dig into. How are you today?
I am great. I'm great. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing great. And that's a lot of miles. I mean, Forrest Gump did it, right? He just kept on going. But there must be something pretty meaningful behind that journey. So get us started with the story of Rick and Jane and this long walk.
Well, it really started in 2005. We have been in full-time ministry all of our lives together, and we felt very concerned about our nation, not necessarily from a political standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint. And we really felt like it was important for us to do something that was drastic for us, but something that would draw attention to the fact that we were praying for our country, that we felt like morally we had kind of gotten off track. And so this is what we felt called to do. And so we started at Santa Monica Pier in California. We walked you mentioned Forrest Gump, and we actually started under that blue arch where Forrest Gump runs under in the movie. And we walked 20 miles a day, 6 days a week for 6 months. That's approximately, we walked as few as 5 miles one day after an injury I had. We walked as long as 23 miles, but we averaged 20 miles a day, 6 days a week. And we arrived in Washington, D.C. on July 4th.
Wow. Okay, so that's nearly a marathon per day.
Yes.
At some point, one of the two of you had this idea. Who came up with it, and what was the sharing of the idea like as far as the relationship goes? Did one of you look at each other and say, I have an idea, and the other one say, you've lost your mind?
Yes. It was my idea. I'd rather say it was God's idea, but I'm the one who had to broach the subject with my wife. And we have a wonderful relationship. We've been married almost 50 years, and we don't keep things from each other. We share everything with each other. But this was one I was a little timid about sharing with her. And actually, a couple weeks passed before I actually sat down and said, this is what I think we're supposed to do. And her first response is, can we ride bikes? And I said, no, I think we need to walk. And so that's what we did. And she was reluctant. At first, took her a few days to kind of get used to the idea. But in the end, it was Jane who really kept us going during the walk. She was my biggest encourager. She had the most physical issues, but she was the most steadfast as far as the commitment to do it. We could have stopped many, many times with good reason. No one would have ever blamed us. But really, she was the impetus to keep going and to keep walking. So there is a relationship issue there.
Well, for sure. And to be able to do that together is something that the two of you will always benefit from.
Yes.
Time
Yes.
together. And at the same time, it's a Herculean physical undertaking. Had you been frequent walkers, is a couple hour walk in the normal course of life for the two of you?
No, and that's one of the things that made it so unbelievable. We were not athletes in any stretch of the imagination. I was the kind of guy who would go to a shopping center and I would drive from one store to the next one, even if they were next door to each other. So I was not a walker. But as soon as we made the decision to do the walk, we trained for a year. We actually walked 1,500 miles the year before the walk. So we started walking a mile or two a day, worked up to 10 miles a day. That was still only half what we were going to walk the first day. But we felt like that was adequate. Turned out it wasn't adequate at all. We really should have walked longer distances. We had no blisters during the year of training, but almost immediately we both developed blisters on the walk. And so that was a major, major challenge. I kind of learned a secret that helped me. I started smearing Vaseline on my feet before I put my socks on, which kept the friction down, but it didn't work for Jane. And she had blisters from one side of the country to the other.
That sounds like a country song. The blisters from one side of the country to the other. I would have to work on the lyrics to that. I'm fascinated by that motivation and your concern for the nation. We'll get into that a little bit later on in our conversation. But I'm also interested in the logistics of how this all worked. If two people are going out for a cross-country walk, well, there's nobody driving the car.
Right.
I don't know how you're plotting your route. I don't know how you're setting up your provisions, how you're determining where that evening you're going to stop. And if it was all just by the seat of your pants, do you walk through a drive-through and grab a hamburger as you're going? How did the logistics of the walk come together?
Well, as I said, we had a year to plan, and not only to physically train, but we actually drove the entire route the year before and plotted out our stops. We were going to camp at night. We had a camper. And so logistically, this is how it worked. We had volunteers, most of whom we didn't know before the walk, who came and drove a support vehicle for us each week. And we walked about 120 miles a week. So our plan was to camp in about the middle of that 120 miles. It never worked out exactly that way, but that was theoretically the way it should work. On Monday morning, our drivers of the support vehicle would drive us backwards 60 miles. We would walk 20 miles. They would stay within 3 or 4 miles with first aid and water and lunch and extra clothes and socks and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, we drove a stake into the ground with a blue flag on it to notate where we had stopped walking. They would pick us up, drive us back to camp. And then the next morning on Tuesday, they would drive us backwards 40 miles to that stake. We would walk 20 miles. They'd pick us up. Wednesday morning, we'd start at the campground and walk out 20 miles the other direction. And that's how we did it. On Saturday afternoon, when we were done, we would move everything 120 miles down the road and start all over again on Monday morning. So we had it planned pretty well. The drivers were amazing. As I said, they came from all over the country. We didn't know them. Moody Radio and K-Love Radio and a lot of places had talked about the walk for several months before we started. And so people would call us. We had a 1-800 number back when those were the big thing. And they would call and say, how can we help? And we'd say, can you come for a week and drive? And so we had different drivers each week all across the country, all the way to Washington, D.C. There were only 2 days on the walk the entire 6 months when we didn't have a driver. Of course, that makes it tough because you have to walk 10 miles out, 10 miles back. So you lose 10 miles. But most of the days we had drivers, and that was the logistics of how it worked.
What year was all this?
2006, 17 years ago. It took 17 years to get this book done. My wife, she is a wonderful journaler. And so she kept 2 journals. One was just a logistical journal. We walked this mile marker to this mile marker. These were the landmarks. This is what physical, landmarks we can cite if somebody ever doubts that we did this. The other one was a journal of every person we met and every conversation we had with them. And that was really the basis for the book. And so right after the walk was concluded, I took her journals and I wrote out a very basic outline of the walk. And then from time to time, I would take it out. To be honest with you, I was not a writer either. Didn't think I could write. And then I think about 2008, a couple years after the walk, I started back to graduate school. And my first class, the professor turned back my paper to me and it looked like a can of red paint had exploded all over it. He said, young man, you really can't write. And you're never going to get this degree if you can't learn to write. And he said, if you'll let me help you, I'll teach you. He was an author himself. And so we began that process. And by the time I got out of the master's degree, I felt like I was a pretty good writer. I pulled the book out, worked on it some more, and then I started my doctorate. And by the time I got done with my dissertation, I thought, I think I can do this. And so I pulled it out again and worked on it a few more years. And of course, the biggest problem with writing books is finding a publisher. And especially for memoirs, they are very, very difficult to peddle to a publisher. Everybody has a story. So they're a dime a dozen as far as the publisher is concerned. So we finally, in May, decided we're going to go ahead. It's ready. We're going to self-publish it. And it has done very well. We've been Amazon bestseller. We have really kind of far surpassed any goals. We were just really wanted the story to get out there because it's such an amazing story. But it's turned out to be more than that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that 2006, we weren't yet holding iPhones in our hands. We were really close, but they really, maybe the version 1 had just come out and that was about it. So you didn't have at your disposal a lot of the technological tools that we would have today for something like this, where you could text somebody, where you could carry on a live stream, where you could do all these different things that are part of our common life today. This was just, it's time to walk.
Yeah.
It's you and Jane. There's no podcast playing in your ears because there are no podcasts in 2006.
Right.
And it's this raw time of getting away, intentionally separating yourself from, I'm guessing, the distractions of life, and spending a lot of time in prayer. I mean, that was the point of this long journey, right? So, what was it that you were most focused on praying about, and what was the spiritual journey like to go along with this physically demanding journey?
Well, we didn't necessarily try to separate ourselves from the rest of society. As a matter of fact, we routed ourselves through every major city that we could along the path. We walked Old 66 from Los Angeles to Oklahoma City, which was about the halfway point. And at that point, Oklahoma City, or Route 66 from Oklahoma City goes north to Chicago. We wanted to go to Washington, D.C. So then we walked basically the I-40 corridor and a 2-lane roads over to Bristol, Tennessee, and then up through Virginia to Washington. So we did have a lot of conversations. That was one of the stated purposes of the walk, was to share our faith with people, to encourage people. And so we made a point to walk through areas where there were lots of people, lots of homeless people. We walked through 5 Native American reservations on purpose. And so we had a lot of interaction with every kind of person imaginable.
Would they come and walk with you?
Sometimes, as a matter of fact, we had some of our drivers who actually walked with us a day or two. Some of the pastors that we met along the way would walk a day with us. But 90% of the time, it was just Jane and I. We had a few folks along the way who wanted to join us. We had a couple of Native Americans in Gallup, New Mexico, who had decided after way too much to drink that they thought it'd be a great idea to come along with us to Washington, D.C. And so we had people who volunteered to do that. But generally speaking, after a mile or two, they decided that wasn't such a great idea. So we did talk to thousands of people, interactions with lots and lots of folks about their life and what was going on. And we had prayer with them, but we also communicated with them. Some of the people that we met on the walk 17 years ago, we are still friends with. We still have relationships with. One lady we met in Muldrow, Oklahoma, has become one of our dearest friends. We just went to see her a few weeks ago. She wanted a stack of books to give to all of her friends. And so we went to see her, and we've kept that relationship going all these years. And so it's really been about relationships with people, relationships with each other. It changed and transformed our marriage in an unbelievable way because you become so dependent on each other in a healthy way. You become very sensitive to your partner's needs, physical needs and emotional needs. And so it really transformed our life in every possible way.
Okay, so in that relationship dynamic, how often during the walk was there a moment where one of you looked at the other and said, I'm not sure this was a great idea. I'm exhausted, my feet are bleeding, and we still have a 1,000+ miles to go. Was there ever a point at which you thought about ending it before you got to DC?
It's very interesting because that didn't work out the way you might think. many nights, Jane's feet were so blistered and so painful that just laying down at night in bed and pulling the sheets up over her feet would make her cry. And so, of course, as her partner and as her husband, I would cry because she was hurting so badly. And I said to her many times, if you want me to finish this by myself, we can do that. If you need to stop, it's okay. If we just need to call it off, nobody will blame us. We'll go home. And as I said earlier, she was the one who kept us on track. And whenever I would offer, she would always say, quitting is not an option. We're going to walk to Washington, D.C., whatever it takes. There were a few times we ran out of money. We thought that perhaps we would just have to stop and work a few weeks somewhere, washing dishes or doing something in a restaurant to get the money to go the next little bit. But it was always provided for us just in time. Crossville, Tennessee, we had broken our last $100 bill to pay the camping fee, and we still had quite a distance to go. And I got a call one day. We did have flip phones back then. I got a call one day at lunch, and the man on the other end said, "How much do you need to finish the walk?" And I didn't even know. And I said, as I figured in my head, well, maybe $3,000. And he said, "Come to church Sunday, and we want you to tell about the walk." And so we did. And they gave us 2 checks for $4,000 total, which was enough to finish the walk. So we saw this over and over and over again, where there were physical issues or financial issues. I had a horrible accident in Russellville, Arkansas, where I spilled a cup of boiling water on my lap. I had to go to the emergency room. They transferred me to the burn center in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Yikes.
And they said, "You won't be walking for at least 2 weeks." And I said, "We don't have 2 weeks. We have to be in Washington, D.C. by July 4th. We had a rally already planned, and the permits already gotten for a rally on the Supreme Court steps on July 4th. And so we didn't have 2 weeks to just lay around. And so that was on a Friday. And it was an amazing thing. On Monday morning, I walked 5 miles. That's the shortest we ever walked. The next day, I walked a few more. And by the end of the week, I was walking a full schedule. And interesting thing about that, we were walking that week, and a car pulled up and pulled in front of us, and the guy got out, and I didn't recognize him at first. And as he got closer, I realized he was the nurse that had taken care of me in the emergency room. And he had heard the doctors tell me not to walk. And he said, "What are you doing out here walking?" I said, "I really can't not walk. We've got to walk." So we just kept walking, and we saw that over and over. So that relationship between Jane and I got stronger and stronger and stronger, because what we realized was when one of us was weak, the other could be strong for them. And so that kept us going. A lot of times I was weak. There were times when I just thought, like you said, what in the world have I done here? Is this the worst decision I ever made in my life? There were times when Jane was physically hurting, but we kept encouraging each other. There was never a time, I don't recall ever a time during that 6 months when we both said, we probably shouldn't do this. One of us or the other was always ready to go, and that kept us both going.
That's so cool to hear. And this determination is, it would have been understandable, Rick, if you had said, "Man, after I spilled the hot water on myself, we had to shut down for a month. I was blistering, I was miserable, and instead, you were determined enough to get right back out there." That, to me, helps solidify what you said earlier about feeling like this was like you were called to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't asked you yet about the background professionally for you and Jane, because I thought maybe this entire journey was self-funded, and that it was not a problem to just shut down life for 6 months and go. Clearly, it was a challenge financially and professionally. What jobs did you do, and how did you set aside whatever monies you could to get this thing started?
Well, we had been in ministry for almost 50 years together.
The
Well,
very
now,
lucrative
but
world of ministry, right?
yeah, but then it was about 30 years or so. And I had pastored churches, and at this particular time, we were traveling the country. We're both musicians. We were doing concerts all over the country. I was preaching. We had actually been all over the world. We'd been to China 3 times to do concerts. We had been in India for 10 days for crusades. We'd been to Mexico twice to build a house and work in orphanages. We'd been all over the world. And so at this particular time, we had never had much money. We raised 3 kids and never made a lot of money. And so we knew when we started to plan this trip that one of the biggest issues we were going to face was financial. How do you take 6 months off from what little income you do have? And so we had fundraisers and we started writing letters, and several churches had rallies and supported us and raised funds. We had one little church out in Taneyville, Missouri, who called us just before the walk started. And they said, we want you to come out. We'd been there several times to minister. And they said, we want you to come out and talk about the walk before you take off. And we said, man, it's a long way to go. Several hundred miles. They said, it'll be worth your while. Come on out. So we did. And after we talked about the walk, they had Jane and I stand at the front of the church, and they gave us a big basket. And the youth and the children of the church started to come up and drop dollar bills and $5 bills and $10 bills in the basket. And they had spent all summer long raising support, having raffles. They raffled off a shotgun. They had car washes. They did all this kind of stuff to raise money. And the dollar bills that they put in that basket were the actual dollars that they raised that people had given them. And they gave us over $1,000, which bought 10 pair of shoes. The shoes in 2006 were very expensive by that day's standard, a little over $100 a pair. And so that bought 10 pair of shoes. And people did that all over the country for us, things like that. They actually gave us a little stick made out of PVC pipe that was painted red. The name of their youth group was the Dynamite Youth Group. They painted it red and put a wick on the end of it like a piece of dynamite, and it opened on the end. And they had all made notes of encouragement and stuffed them inside this piece of PVC. And they said, we want you to take this with you on the trip. And every time you get discouraged, open it up and pull one of the notes out, which we did on the pier at Santa Monica, on the Supreme Court steps in Washington, and several places in between. When we were discouraged, we would open that stick of dynamite up and pull a note out and read it.
How thoughtful.
So that's what we did. We had all kinds of fundraisers ourselves. We had yard sales. We actually put our house up for sale and sold just about everything in it to raise money for the walk. And then some folks helped along the way. And as I said, churches helped too. So that was the financial part of it. And it was just divine provision all the way across America.
So all told, what do you think the walk cost?
I would estimate that we thought that when we started the walk, it would be about $17,000 for us to put fuel in the vehicles and get the clothing we needed, shoes we needed, and all that sort of thing, and provide just a minimum amount of income so that we could continue to pay the mortgage and things back home until the house sold. And so that's what we thought. But really, it was several $1,000s more than that. We ended up having to buy double the shoes that we thought. We actually used 20 pair of shoes across America. When you walk every day, we rotated the shoes. We wore a pair in the morning and a pair in the afternoon. That's what we had been advised to do. Because if you wear one pair of shoes over and over and over and over, they never have a chance to recover. And so they wear out much quicker. But even at rotating shoes every half a day, we wore out 20 pair of shoes. I mean, they weren't, if you looked at them, you'd say they're perfectly fine. But if you tried to walk in them, it was like walking on concrete because the cushioning would compress. I actually lost 2 inches of height on the walk. I was 6 foot before the walk started. I was 5'10" afterwards.
Wow.
And when I went to the doctor and they measured me, and I said, what's this all about? Do I have some kind of bone disease or what's not? And the doctor said, no, you took 5 million steps and the weight of your body compressed your spine and you lost height. I also gained a size in shoe size. My wife gained a size and a half in shoe size, which we've never lost because your feet spread out and the bones change and the structure changes, and that just never goes back.
That's wild. I would never have known that. Going through all those pairs of shoes as well. I mean, the wear and tear and this journey. And I want to take everybody now to the end of the journey where you July 4th on the steps of the Supreme Court. Before I ask you about the message that you shared there, can you bring us into how it felt that morning when you woke up and you knew this was the big day of the rally, that you had taken all of the measures needed to procure the permits to do all that, but the reality is the biggest steps were the literal steps, the 5 million steps that you took to get there. So you get to the culmination of this effort. What was it like that morning as you literally climbed whatever, a couple dozen steps to the perch where you were going to speak?
What actually started when we started for the day, the last few miles, we had about 30 friends and family who had come to Washington, D.C. to walk with us across the bridge from Arlington Memorial Cemetery into where the Lincoln Memorial is. And they were waiting for us at the Virginia side of the bridge. Jane and I had started our walk that morning right at the edge, the top edge of the Arlington Memorial Cemetery. And the first thing that we saw was the statue that represents Iwo Jima. And right beside that statue, the Marine Corps band was playing hymns. It was the most unbelievable goosebump kind of feeling that you could imagine, because here we were, the last day, July 4th. Here's the Marine. It's almost like the Marine Corps band is welcoming us to Washington, D.C. You know, we knew that wasn't the case, but it was almost like God was saying, well done, you made it. And so we walked down to the edge, jumped over the rock fence that surrounds the cemetery, and we're ready to walk across the bridge. And there's a big sign there that says bridge closed. And someone had called in a bomb threat that morning, and they had scuba divers down trying to see if there were bombs underneath this bridge. And so we were delayed for about an hour. Remember, we've got a permit that has a timestamp on it. You can meet at the Supreme Court step from this time to this time. And so we were there about an hour. But the interesting thing is, while we were there waiting for the bridge to reopen with our friends, the Washington Times reporter shows up to cover this bridge threat. And she sees us dressed alike, and she sees our friends all milling around with us. And so she walks up and wants to know what's going on. We have an hour to talk to this woman and tell her all about the walk. She takes color pictures. The next day, we're on the front page of the second section of the Washington Times, full color picture of us walking across the bridge, full story about the walk across America. And it was amazing. When we got to the other side of the bridge, we knelt with our friends and prayed. And then we went on to the Supreme Court steps. I gave a speech, and I talked about how we had discovered so many great things about our nation, about our country, and about its people. How God had broken down some prejudices that we had, how God had worked in our hearts and transformed us. We always said that when the walk was over and we began to analyze what had happened, we said the greatest transformation that happened during the walk across America wasn't to the people we talked to. The greatest transformation happened in us, because our outlook, the way we saw people, the way we interacted with people, that all changed in an unbelievable way. We began to see Native Americans differently. We began to see African Americans differently. Our favorite place to walk on the entire walk, people-wise, was West Memphis, Arkansas, which is a very, very African American community. And I always tell people, I was buried in more African American bosoms than I can count. Because as we'd walk and we'd share, these women would just grab me and hug me and bury me, and I had to come up for air. I mean, it was an amazing thing, and we were accepted and received by people on the street, by homeless people, by Native Americans, without prejudice, without any problems at all. People said, you shouldn't walk in this neighborhood or that neighborhood. This is dangerous. Matter of fact, in one of the places where we walked, we actually were being yelled at by people passing by in cars, who said, you shouldn't be in this neighborhood. You shouldn't be here. This is dangerous. And we just kept walking. We never, in almost 3,000 miles, we never felt threatened by a human being. Dogs, that was a completely different story. But humans never threatened us. We never felt like anyone was going to cause us harm. We did have a lot of very scary moments with dogs, a wolf hybrid, some pit bulls, and some, animals that were there to protect and guard when we were walking back roads in Virginia and in Tennessee, back in the mountains. It was pretty scary, but we got through it all.
How about with vehicles?
Um, we were almost hit a couple of times. My wife got real close one time because we walked on shoulders a lot.
Right.
And so sometimes people just weren't paying attention and they'd get a little closer than we'd like. Trains were a little bit of an issue out in Arizona. We couldn't walk on a lot of I-40 if Route 66 was gone, which is the case probably 30, 35, 40% of the time. We would walk on the interstate with special permission from the Highway Patrol, but sometimes we couldn't get that permission. And so we would walk beside the railroad tracks. Most people don't know this, but the Santa Fe Railroad was built before Route 66, and Route 66 basically parallels the Route 66 train track, or the Santa Fe train tracks. So if we couldn't walk on I-40 and 66 was gone, we would go up and walk next to the railroad tracks. It kept us on track. But sometimes if we were walking on the tracks and we came to a big ravine or a big gully, the train tracks went across from one side to the other. And so we'd get down and we'd feel the tracks, make sure they weren't vibrating, and then we'd take off running from one side of the chasm to the other, hoping that a train wouldn't come.
Movie, there's a scene in Stand By Me, I think, where the young boys had that exact same moment, and it didn't go so well. So.
Yeah. Well, we were safe every time. We made it through. We had some scary moments from time to time, but we almost got trapped out in the desert one night when our drivers got lost from us, and we had no cell service. And so we'd see mountain lion paw prints in the sand a lot of times. So there were some moments when we wondered if we would make it to Washington, but we did.
Well, the last question I have for you, Rick, is let's go back to the steps. And what message did you want to share? I mean, you certainly went to great lengths to get to that point. And America has, how should I say this? America has not solved all of her problems since then to now.
Right.
So I'd love to have you close out our time together by sharing with our audience what you wanted that audience to hear when you were on the steps of the Supreme Court.
All right. Well, here is the determination we made by the time the walk was over. When we began, we thought it was about the steps. What we found out very quickly was it wasn't about the steps nearly as much as it was about the stops. It was the people we talked to. It was the relationships we formed. It was the transformation that took place during those stops. And so the steps were necessary because they connected the stops, but the steps weren't the primary purpose after we got started and we saw what was actually happening. The stops were the purpose. And so we were always looking. One of the best places to talk to people is at a bus stop, because they're kind of captive audiences. They're there waiting for the next bus and they can't get away from you. They can't leave. And so you have this opportunity, but we found the most wonderful relationships and formed the most wonderful relationships at bus stops with people. They even miss their buses sometimes as we talked and would have to catch the next one. And so what I guess I'd want people to know is what life is about. Sometimes we think that life is about the steps. It's about getting from this place to that place. It's about making this move up the corporate ladder. It's about getting the next promotion. It's about, some other thing that we've decided we need to do, the bigger house, the bigger car, whatever. But life really isn't about the steps. That's not where we find the greatest fulfillment in life. The greatest fulfillment in life comes not with the steps, but with the stops, the relationships we make with people, the relationships we have with our spouse, with our children, with the people we work with, the people we worship with. Those relationships are what carry us through. Those relationships, believe me, it was not our bodies that carried us through almost 3,000 miles. It was the relationships, knowing that today we might meet someone who was discouraged. We met a man in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who he had hitchhiked from Dallas to Albuquerque because his son was in prison and he came to visit his son. He needed encouragement. He needed someone to put their arm around him and pray for him and say it's going to be okay. And that's where we got the strength to go on day after day, because we never knew who was at the next bus stop, who was at the next corner, who was going to be broken down with their car, who was going to have an issue that we could solve. And so we kept walking so that we could get to the next stop.
The story is powerful, to say the very least. The book is called And So We Walked, the inspirational story of a couple's walk across America. Rick and Jane McKinney. And of course, you can get that book everywhere they're available. Amazon would be the most common place. And Rick, thank you for kind of catching us up to speed on a journey that is unlike any I've heard before. What a pleasure to hear your testimony, your motivation, your determination, and that the message that you're sharing is still pertinent today, right?
Yes, it
Not
is.
gone out of
Absolutely.
style. Yeah.
Nope. It's still pertinent today.
Do you have any more walks planned, by the way?
No, I'm 67 years old now. We were over 50 when we made this walk, by the way. And I'm 67. I teach at the university that's about 20 miles away. And I have a woodworking business. And we've written this book, and really promoting this book has turned out to be a full-time job. And so I'm as busy as I want to be. No more walks for us right now. I wanted to walk the other direction from the tip of Texas to Canada. But I can be honest and just tell you, and she would tell you if she was here, my wife vetoed that very quickly.
She has veto power, and
She does have veto
exercised.
power. Yeah.
Well, Rick, I walked 18 holes yesterday and I'm pretty tired, so I cannot imagine the journey that you went on. So thank you for sharing it. A pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much.